Good afternoon. I'm Stephanie Sanford. I'm Chief of Global Policy and External Relations at the College Board. We're a 120-year-old education nonprofit that helps millions of students a year navigate their path to college and career. You likely know us through our programs, the SAT, Advanced Placement, and our college planning site, Big Future. In addition to helping students, we also help professionals in education. We provide tools and advocacy for counselors, admissions, and financial aid officers so they can better support students too. Before coming to the College Board, I spent 11 years in education and advocacy at the Gates Foundation. I am honored to participate in this terrific event and explore an urgent topic with three super smart leaders in our field. Our discussion today is about assessing the future. Assessment as a valuable and necessary tool to support teaching and learning. But assessment's really become a loaded word in the education world right now. Like so much of today's discourse, the debate is often reduced to a simplistic, polarized notion. In the case of this, it's test, yes or no, test, good or bad. We also hear test or assessment as a synonym for accountability, which is really a metric for policymakers more than a tool for teachers and students. And even more recently, the talk of holding people accountable now has almost an implicit accusation of wrongdoing. So here we are. Support for these terms, assessment and accountability, is really at a low point for as long as I've been doing this. Yet our need for quality measurement to really know where students are and where they need to go to accelerate their learning post-COVID has sort of never been more important. We know the massive disruption of the last 18 months has impacted students in widely different ways. And yet, how do we really know? And what do we do about it, especially if we don't have data about where students are in their learning? Measurement, knowing where students are so we can help them get to where they need to be, has never been more important or urgent now as we come out of the pandemic. So for the next half hour or so, we're here to have a serious and specific discussion about how assessment can be used effectively by educators and families to meet students where they are and help them get back on track. So to explore these topics, we have gathered three leading experts from different facets of education. Larry Berger is the co-founder and CEO of Amplify. It's a company that builds high-quality learning materials and assessments in language arts, math, and science. Larry has been a Rhodes Scholar, a White House Fellow, and a board member at the Academy of American Poets. But my absolute favorite of Larry's many contributions to the world of letters and learning is that he served on the board of the Institute for Sustained Attention, figuring out how the humanities can help us all cope with the distractions of modern life. I can't imagine anything more important, and I trust that means Larry will be paying much closer attention than anyone else during this panel. Sonia Santelises is the CEO of the Baltimore City Public Schools, where she's won widespread praise for a steady and confident response to the city's many challenges due to the disruption of the pandemic. During more than 30 years in the education world, Dr. Santelises has been a teacher, a curriculum specialist, a Harvard lecturer, a national policy advocate, and an assistant superintendent focused on innovative schools. In addition to serving Baltimore's 79,000 students, Dr. Santelises is also the mother of 3 school-age daughters, so she sees education from every angle. Baltimore Sun ran an editorial last year begging her to stick around, which I don't need to tell anyone is not a common occurrence of a big city district leader. And finally, Constance Steinheller-Squire is a professor of informatics at the University of California, Irvine, and a leading expert on computer games as a tool for deep learning. She leads the university's Games, Learning, and Society Center, championing the role of gaming creating positive social change. She's been advisor in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And in addition to her advanced degrees, she has 3 bachelor's degrees, one in mathematics, one in literature, and one in religious studies. If you want to make a career out of computer games, you need to be a real polymath. Clearly, this is a polymath panel. Thank you all so much for being here. It really is an honor to share the stage and share the screen with you. So I'm going to start with an opening question for each of you, and then we'll do follow-ups and discussion. And so seriously, feel free to interact. So let's get started. Larry, your company uses thoughtful, low-stakes assessment to help guide learning in the classroom. as students return to school after all these disruptions, we've heard a lot about meeting students where they are, taking account of the different levels of learning over the last 18 months. How can teachers do that well? And what does the next generation of assessment look like in a hybrid model?
So right now, I think the thing we want them to be doing is focusing on kids, the relationships with kids, because we know that at this moment, reestablishing connections to classmates and to the teacher are really fundamental. But we also want to make sure that the activities that teachers are doing include opportunities to gather data, both with some structure so that we're doing informal reading inventories with young kids, we're understanding where kids are in their mathematical development as they get older. But these can be formative assessments. They don't have to have lots of stakes attached to them. They're really an opportunity to understand where the district is, where the class is, what the needs of each child are. And I think the focus needs to be there at the beginning. There have been some proposals. We need to bring back the high stakes test at the beginning of the year to get a baseline for everyone is at where everyone is. And I worry that may do more harm than good. I think people need a little bit of data now, a little bit of data at the middle of the year. And then we do have to make sure that an infrastructure for understanding where are we compared to past years is reliably in place by the end of this school year. And so, I tend to say to schools, figure out what you want to do instructionally, figure out what you want to do to get the relationships established and back in place, and then talk to folks who have some expertise in assessment to make sure that you actually are gathering enough data to be able to say some things that are useful to powering the system and understanding where resources need to be deployed.
So that's super interesting. We're trying to assess on multiple levels and multiple dimensions. So Sonia, when you and I spoke last month, you talked about the need to assess not just where every student stands academically after the past year, but also a comprehensive look at their social emotional well-being. How do you do that kind of assessment at scale while also measuring, as Larry suggests, learning loss?
No, and it really is, Stephanie, I think a challenge in that we typically look at students through one or two quantitative measures, and we're used to that scaling up at a district level. The approach we're taking is how do we document the other pieces that go into a student's learning that we all know are there. And as I think Larry, and I didn't know he was going to say this, but rightly noted, not everything is a formal assessment. So part of what we are looking to do is how do we, for example, capture what a young person might have encountered over the last 18 months, right? So a real living example for us is a middle grades honors math student who ended up living with a grandmother and then was homeless for part of the time. Well, when that student comes back in August, do they cease to be an honors math student because they had challenges that got in the way? Or is the question more rightly situated in what has this child experienced? What is this student's strengths? And how do we build on those strengths? And then how do we actually put all that together for a profile of that student that takes into account the academic data, but also where that student might be from a social emotional perspective and the additional support. So the way we're approaching that in Baltimore City is to really look at how do we have learning profiles of each student and to give teachers and other professionals within the school the space within that first quarter and that return to school to develop profiles, not just from their vantage point, but also bringing in families and bringing in the students themselves to really talk about what are these various dimensions of them as a whole student. And then I think that puts us in a much better position to accelerate the learning we know needs to occur based on the last 18 months.
So we're talking about sort of multiple dimensions, multiple domains, then to get to sort of, to sort of a good thick sense of where the student is. Constance, you're really, I think, of sort of in an area around the bend. How can games be, given this unusual context, how can games be used to measure learning? What kind of real world applications have you seen in game-based assessments?
Thank you for the question. I mean, I think games are really an interesting medium, not just for learning, but also for assessment. They have some key affordances that many standardized sort of traditional tests don't have. First, they already offer engaged forms of learning. You know, they're a space in which you don't have to actually worry as much about engaging kids. Games are designed to engage them already, and engagement actually matters and impacts performance. We've seen that in all of our research on assessment abroad. But second, they give these great data streams. We consider it clickstream data or telemetry. You can start to use those data streams to think about not just forms of summative assessment, but forms of formative assessment. You know, in my view, in the end of the day, assessment needs to be a tool between a teacher, a student, and their parents. And to the extent that it fails to be that tool, I would argue that it's not a very useful assessment. So one thing that games can give you, because they are simulations, is they can give you real insight into the ongoing activity that a student is engaging in, and not just the end result of that activity. And that can be very, very powerful. You know, we've talked about formative assessment for years and years, I mean, decades, but it's very hard to scale and it's very intense on teachers to implement. So when you can use technologies that can help scale that and help offset the labor of doing that kind of formative assessment, it can be very empowering and enriching. For positive examples, I mean, I would look to the SBIR program that Ed Metz runs over in the Department of Education at the federal level. But there's also fantastic work coming out of Glass Lab, Filament Games, iCivics, dare I say our own lab. So there are examples now, more than a decade of examples of incredible forms of assessment that are out there in the marketplace.
So from all three of you, if each of you had to make a prediction on what we've seen over the past year, because it seems that we have a notion that we had what came before, and then we had all of this innovation and all of the stuff and disruption that happened over this last 18 months. And so if you had to make a prediction about what would stick, like what that we didn't know would stick, what's it going to look like, do you think, over the years ahead? So why don't I start with you, Constance? We'll go in the reverse order.
Well, I think for one thing, you know, I'm a parent of two teen boys. I think that many of us realized when pandemic hit that these digital play spaces are really vital to kids, and acting as though they're going to go away or you can firewall them out is mistaken. Instead, you know, structuring and mentoring those spaces is a really important thing to do across the board, regardless of assessment. I think things that you're starting to see really percolate up and stick are engagement online, engagement that's peer-to-peer, that also can have digital dashboards for teachers and for parents to help regulate and structure and enrich it. But I think some of those strategies that are kind of hybrid after-school strategies that build on in-school skills, maybe one place that we see stick. And then finally, I would say, you know, there's a huge rise of esports, believe it or not, competitive video game play across. First, it really began in the U.S. Professional, then it seeped down into collegiate varsity teams, and now we're seeing that at the high school and even middle school level. And there's a wide range of what those programs look like. You know, from my perspective, when you're working with kids after school, you have the promise of doing good, and we ought to make sure that those programs actually make good on that promise.
So Sonia, how about you? What do you think sticks? I mean, you've been so successful in navigating so much change. What do you think of the innovations that you put in place? You think should stick or will stick?
So I think one of them is what we heard loud and clear from students for a long time, but frankly, the last 18 months worth of challenge and shift has allowed us to really hone in on, and that is the connection between the world of work and the world of school. The real world has come crashing in, particularly for students in underserved communities. Now, what's interesting is when we look at what we do, what we use to assess, and its relevance in that world of work, there's a different set of skills that need to come into play. And what young people are doing across the country, and particularly in urban school districts, and we're seeing it all over, is they are making their own individual return on investment assessment. To what extent is school compelling enough, engaging enough to their immediate reality? And that question really gives us the opportunity, I think, to answer far more creatively than past bureaucratic structures that just counted seat time allowed us to do. There are lots of innovations in how to connect K-12 to industries that frankly don't require a traditional 4-year sequencing of college, but actually allow through a combination of credentialing and higher ed for young people to get that exposure early. So whether it's in the gaming that Constance described, or frankly for a lot of our young people who at the age of 15 and 16 are rethinking what manufacturing will look like in the next 15 to 20 years. So I think if we seize upon this opportunity to really combine relevance and engagement, we really can change some of the trajectory if we don't just let it drift away as something that happened then but has no relevance in the future.
So Larry, what do you think? You have been an innovator through your entire career. Is this the moment that these innovations, that this disruption has made these innovations more likely?
I think so. I mean, it's actually a very simple change that happened, but it's an all-important one for a certain kind of innovation that we've been waiting to take hold in education, which is just that this is the year that students did their work digitally across the country. And we have lots of digital divide issues to work our way through, but we've really started to invest in them. So as a country, we are working on what does it take to get all kids connected. And most school districts made the leap that as much as that was still a problem, the need was to find ways to teach digitally and for students to do work digitally. Now, as we come back into classrooms, I think a lot of teachers and frankly kids are eager to not teach digitally, to not necessarily have all instruction coming through screens. But I think the part where students do their work, they write the essay, they answer the questions, they give each other feedback, they network around how they're doing homework, I think a bunch of that stuff is going to stick. And the value of that is not just that those tools have efficiencies, they have feedback loops. They also, as Constance said earlier, produce a stream of data about how kids are doing. And if you think about what assessment is an effort to gather up 50 or 60 tasks that you put in front of a student, and those tasks are well chosen to be indicative of how that student's doing in reading or math or science. If instead you get to put hundreds or thousands of tasks in front of kids because you're just doing work every day that is relevant to science and math and reading, then you are arguably getting more data of the sort that the assessment system needs. And so we are just at the beginning of being able to say that it's equitable, that all kids can access opportunities to do their work digitally. Again, work to be done, but huge leap forward. And once that's true, the ability for modern kinds of data analysis to apply to that work and to begin to make much more detailed profiles of the sort that Dr. Santelises was just mentioning of how kids are doing and what they need to get to the next level in their development. And so that has been something that for which the data analytical tools have actually existed for a while, at least the initial forms of them, but not enough kids were doing the work digitally for it to work as a system. And now I think the virtuous cycle of we have the data, we have the tools, they are making each other better, is one of the real areas of excitement in education technology right now.
So that's super interesting, this notion of personalization. Larry, in your first response, you implied we need some sense of how things are going over time. How are students doing before, and what happened, and then how are they doing later? Even amid this great opportunity for much more granular data, much more personalization. How important is it to maintain that trend from the past and then to do that going forward? I mean, the best notion of sort of accountability, not in its negative sense, but in a system sense. How's it going as a system, and how do we know how students are doing over time? How important is
So I do think it's important that systems have some indication of what the COVID loss was so that they can plan for the magnitude of the COVID recovery. But my sense is that in systems around the country, the awareness is the COVID loss was, we always knew it was big, and we are getting our heads around the fact that it is bigger than we thought. Sometimes showing up in the kind of socio-emotional issues that were discussed earlier, but mostly around just pure academic performance. Kids are at much higher risk of reading failure in early grades. Some of the advanced mathematics just didn't happen. And then harder to measure things like, was there serious, rigorous discourse happening on Zoom? And the answer is not nearly as much as the system needed to develop kids to be able to do advanced work. And so I think we need that indication of just how big that gap is, because there were some early rumors, maybe it's not as big as we think it is. And I think as better and better data emerges, it is big and there's a gap to close. It's closable, and I think resources are showing up in school districts to help them close it. But I think we need that. After that, I am not sure we need to be constantly referencing where we were in the past and how this relates, and we're still 19% behind where kids normally would be. I think the thing we want to keep referencing is what Dr. Santalis referred to as the student profile. We need to say, like, we understand the system as a whole has a big gap to close. Now let's focus on kids and figure out what they need to get where they're going, and less a kind of focus on some accountability metric from before, which frankly will be discouraging. I liken it to, like, if my daily diet required knowing, like, needing to get back to my high school weight, that's a lot of distant goal to pursue. But if I know what I'm trying to accomplish this month, it's a lot more achievable, and there can be some wins along the way.
I'd like a weight loss analogy. So there's a lot going on here. I mean, and the notion of how much of screen time and how that changes our relationship, thinking about what students are doing on screen. I mean, Constance, this is your bread and butter. I think, historically, in before times, and maybe even during Zoom school times, there's been a sense of parents worry when they see students, they see their kids spending too much time on screen, and particularly on games. But you've argued that they're actually good for learning and engagement and socializing. What does time well spent look like in the gaming world?
That is such a great question. I'm going to admit right now that while the entire world was waking up to the idea that being online is not just some horrible, impoverished version of reality, I was waking up to the fact that it's not enough. I'm a big believer that learning happens between people, and technology either enables that or it gets in the way. And so we need to make sure our technologies are enabling our conversations, enabling intersubjectivity between mentors and mentees. I mean, good gaming, in my view, it's done with peers and friends. It's engaged, it's challenging work, but it's also enriched and mentored. And by that, I mean that, it isn't, I think that being online is a normal part of everyday life now, but it can't be all that we do. And when kids are online, especially most of those kids are middle and high schoolers, little ones outside of class are not typically online too much, or at least in theory. Data might suggest otherwise. But I think that those spaces need to have more enrichment and more mentoring than simply a parent at the door talking about the quantity of screen time. Because it is not simply about the quantity of game time or time on task. It's actually about what kind of social emotional skills, social skills, resilience. What are the skills and the values that are getting enculturated online? And some of those in some game spaces may not be the ones that we want our kids involved with. And I think we ought to deal with that. We ought to actually spend more time thinking about how these play spaces online end up breeding things like intolerance, end up breeding things like a lack of digital equity, a lack of humanity online. And I will say that I don't mean to suggest that it's gamers that are a problem. I would suggest right now that all of humanity, including adults, are a problem. The way that we're interacting online is as if we are not humans sharing a community and a planet together. And I think we have long strides to go there. And the only way I know to get there is to get parents and teachers there, engaged, literally playing with them or knowing something about the games that their kids and their students are engaged with, and actually having rich discussions in which kids can understand what being online in a humane, life-enhancing way looks like. It's very possible, but it's not going to happen. Kids aren't going to discover that on their own. I think adults might need some intervention on some of that as well.
So it's just fascinating as we're now talking about sort of what the implications were for this big disruption. I think, Larry, you said it really, really succinctly. We had a bunch of disruptions, but the big disruption in education really was students started doing a lot of work digitally. And so now I think the question really, this set of questions brought up by this group, which I think was such a rich conversation and in kind of directions I'm not sure that I expected. I mean, we talked about the disruption was really around, going online. Now we're talking about what is looking forward, what will the balance be between what is interacting digitally and how we use our time in person. And does that mean, we were here to talk about sort of innovations in assessment, but we're also talking about real innovations in how we spend our time together. And then these digital tools that took us, that enabled us to keep learning but took us apart, then does that lead us to a place where we have much richer and the ability to personalize much more? Not just around academics, but also around social and emotional learning, as Sonia told us and has done so well in Baltimore. I also heard that we need to not obsess about what came before, but lean into what we need to do now, and to really then understand the level of the problem and lean into these tools and the level of specificity and personalization that will allow us to pursue. And then I think another thing that was surprising to me that I heard was the idea, we've always heard that students want things to be more relevant, but now we're saying is that actually the barriers between school and work and home and school and online and in person are maybe much more blurred. And finally, for all of the talk about technology over the last 10 to 20 years, that this disruption really gave us the opportunity to lean into those tools. Larry, I was so struck that a standard assessment, you said you pulled together, 60 or so items that you determine what a student knows and is able to do. But now with these new tools that this disruption probably accelerated into being, that we'll be able to have hundreds, if not thousands of data points to be able to then truly personalize to be able to personalize learning and to be able to measure in a much more granular and effective way learning over time. So what I'm hearing really is a lot of optimism about a topic that has been kind of negative, which is, what is the future of assessment? What is the future of measurement in this sort of polarized world? Test, yes or no? What I have heard is disruption, yes, but opportunity, way bigger, yes, based on the sort of tools and innovation and leadership that each of you have really provided in your respective disciplines. So let me thank you so much for your time and for the work that you all have done and will continue to do as we come out of this truly unprecedented moment in our world's history, but in our education system in the U.S. Thank you so much for your time and for your leadership.